everybody. Welcome to the Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture series. My name is Julian. Hello on Instagram and on YouTube above. If you're new to this is basically a weekly introductory lecture, a 50-minute lecture where I try to break down some of the more conceptual ideas within so-called continental theory, philosophy, psychoanalysis. There's a strong emphasis on Slavoj Žižek's philosophy, Lacon, Freud, Marx, Hegel, Kant, what will you? And for those of you who are familiar with this project, I've been hosting these lectures for the past 3 years, if you can believe it or not. And for the past 2 years, I've also been uploading the lectures to Patreon as audio files. So if you'd like to access all of my lectures on a week-to-week basis, plus a whole bunch of members-only perks, please go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I'm going to put the link in the description and in the bio as well. A huge thank you to our patrons who keep this project alive and well. It's so incredibly, unspeakably, inspiring to me that you essentially provide me with some financial means to keep this open access channel alive and well. It's been an enormous dream of mine to be able to continue teaching outside of academia and to do it in a way that's accessible to anybody from around the world. Open access education is a lifelong ambition and dream of mine, and I'm so grateful to the patrons who allow me to keep doing this. And especially because it means that we can make it accessible without dumbing it down, without simply turning philosophy into content, which I think is something worth aspiring to. On that note, I would love it if you dropped a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. We are a global community of lifelong learners who are interested in philosophy, literature, poetry, art, cinema, and I just love that we can start our week this way. So please do leave a comment. I see someone from Boulder, Colorado. Hello, good morning. Texas, hello Texas. I like the cowboy hat. Seoul, Korea, hello, that's wonderful. India again. Austria, good morning or good evening, Austria. India, Romania, India. Oh my gosh, we have so many people joining from India today. South Korea, hello. Bolivia, hello, Bolivia. New York City. I'm actually coming to New York City in a couple of weeks. India, Iraq, wow, that's incredible. Hello to Iraq, Vietnam, Germany, Hamburg, Turkey. That's incredible. Malaysia. Thank you guys so much. It really genuinely means a lot that you guys let me know where you're joining in from. Call me naive, but I get a visceral thrill from knowing that we are connecting in this way. It's what gets me up in the morning, and I just love getting to start my week this way. Like, I find sharing this space and teaching so incredibly enriching. Okay, so let's begin, because there's a lot that I want to cover today. The topic that I want to cover today is something that I've actually been seeing a lot of questions about, which is Slavoj Žižek... Hello YouTube, I'm sorry. Hello YouTube, I'm sorry the connection is so poor. We're going to keep trying. Slavoj Žižek's conceptual work and Lacan's psychoanalysis, while appearing to be somewhat Buddhist in nature, is in fact not Buddhist. I'm going to look at some of Zizek's arguments about Buddhism, the relationship of Buddhism to Lacanian desire and Freudian drive, and also integrate it into a critique of what you might call vulgar Buddhism, or sort of the popularized version of Buddhism that is a perfect supplement to capitalist consumer culture. Along the way, I'm going to try to take that and talk about one of Zizek's key conceptual ideas, which you might call eppur si muove, or and yet it moves, which is a reference to Galileo, and the ontological argument that Zizek makes about eppur si muove, and yet it moves. All that and more coming up in the next 45 minutes or so. Let's hope that the Wi-Fi connection remains sound. If you're new to this channel, I just want you to briefly know that this is meant for both beginners and more advanced students. So even if there's some parts that might seem too technical or too laden with jargon, hopefully you'll see that as an invitation to participate in more classes and to do more of your own reading and study to alienate viewers or students. Okay, so I want to start with Zizek on Buddhism. Now, many people have observed that some of the key ideas with central tenets of Buddhism. Now, one of the central tenets of Buddhism, and I'm no expert here, is essentially able to detach your relationship to worldly desires and illusions. Say, if something is bothering you, you can identify this as being an object that is bothering you, but then instead of trying to fix that object, you sort of put it yourself and you say, who am I to be bothered by this? Essentially, we have here a very radical inquiry into the nature of the self and selfhood. And the idea that desire is something that creates ego, and that ego is something that has to be fought. I'm generalizing here, right? And that we have to fight for a release from desire within Buddhism, which eventually, ultimately, would lead to a form of nirvana, a kind of release from the material world into a spiritual realm of bliss. Now, one of the things that is distinctly Lacanian here, of course, is the assumption that there is no that there exists a kind of sadomasochistic element within the initial gesture of Buddhism, which is to say, instead of allowing yourself the hysterical relation to the other, namely, what has this person done to me? Why have they done this to me? Who am I to be deserving of this kind of pain, right? This kind of slightly hysterical in the strict psychoanalytic sense of the relation to the other, but also the slight pathetic, victimizing narcissism of thinking, why is this happening to me, isn't allowed under Buddhism. One of the primary gestures of the Buddhist relation to the self has, who are you to be thinking that you are worthy of thinking that the other person is harming you, etc. In other words, it alienates or pulls out of the solipsistic engagement with the self, and say that part of the problem is your attachment to the self, which is attached to the idea of an imaginary other. And that therefore the initial step within Buddhism is to detach from this narcissistic attachment that you have to the other and to yourself. Now, what's important here is that while this initial gesture might seem very similar, namely almost like in a Stoic sense, right? Marcus Aurelius, who says that when he goes to the public baths, he anticipates being splashed on by somebody and therefore becoming annoyed. And so he visualizes, like a meditatio malorum, he visualizes the negative so that when it indeed happens, he is no longer strife with the splasher, the person who has been wet. On the one hand, that seems to be like a proto-Buddhist idea, right? You imagine the thing the other do to you, you prepare yourself for it so that when it happens, you don't lash out in anger and you retain self-control. And yet, fundamentally, that doesn't appear to be a very Buddhist way of thinking. Here we have a difference between Stoicism and Buddhism. The Stoic holds on very strongly to the idea of the attachment of the self to the symbolic other, except rises above it or tries to find some neutral grounding where control is maintained. Whereas the Buddhist gesture, become free from desire, become free from your own ego, become free from the fear of the other, and so on and so forth. In other words, we have here a difference between alienation, which occurs within Stoicism, alienation from the symbolic engagement, which therefore seems to provide you with a neutral grounding upon which your actions can be based, hence also the comfort of a certain stoicist attitude to life, where you feel like you can step outside of life and think about it neutrally, versus not the alienation, but the separation of the self that occurs within Buddhism. That the very attachment to the self therefore becomes something that has to be mediated, that has to be protected from desire. Now, of course, I'm generalizing here, but the reason I'm generalizing is that I'm trying to make a point about Zizek's attitude towards Buddhism. Now, this is where Žižek comes in. Slavoj Žižek essentially, book on Hegel, Slavoj Žižek essentially argues that the key difference between psychoanalysis and Buddhism, while they may seem to be similar, after all, it's about the relationship between desire, the key difference comes with the problem of drive. Now, Freudian perspective, drive that is insurmountable. Drive is in fact something that one aspires towards, that when you traverse the fundamental fantasy, as Lacon calls it, of desire, you thereby become the master of your desire, which means that you've entered the realm of drive. However, from a Freudian perspective, drive is precisely not something neutral that you can acquire and sort of make your own, a kind of discipline. Instead, drive is the very immutable principle by which the impossible, let's call it out of jointedness of life as such, is something that always persists. In other words, the central point I'm trying to make is that within the idea of Buddhism, the idea of nirvana, this could never exist within Lacanian or Freudian psychoanalysis. That the idea of inner peace, of nirvana, is something that does not exist for Lacan, nor does it exist for Freud. And so the problem of nirvana is thereby the problem of the location of this nirvana within psychoanalysis. This is something that Žižek argues in one of his lengthy footnotes. He says, if we even think about nirvana, we have to think about it in at least two different ways. First of all, is nirvana simply the transcendental horizon that the subject has to reach at a given point, thereby leaving the world of desire and material? Is nirvana therefore an individualistic pursuit that you have to attain at some point, that you have transcended the world of illusions? Or vice versa, and perhaps we have here a more Freudian, more Marxist take on nirvana, is nirvana a state that is reached here on earth? Here we would essentially have the Hegelian idea of the master. Now, for Hegel, the idea of the master is never the person who stands simply above all the others. For Hegel, the master is the one who can liberate everybody else. What's key here, though, is that this liberation, like the ultimate Hegelian master, is never the person who simply comes and severs other people's chains. It's never simply, I am the master and I am now freeing you. I have made you free. Instead, the very figure of the master is the one who, in his own freedom, sets others free. You could actually say here, and this is sort of evident even in Hegel, that we therefore have a Christian or New Testament take on the idea of the master figure. After all, from a Hegelian perspective, Christ on the cross is thereby the master figure. That Christ dying for people's sins, the key moment of the ontology by which we go from an old-fashioned transcendental Old Testament Christianity, where we have the God in the sky who's sort of hidden from us, versus us people trying to be reunited with the Godhead, a kind of consequence of the New Testament, which is, of course, has another name, which is the Trinity. Namely, the key moment on the cross where God briefly stops believing in himself. We have the materialization of God in Christ, and yet the perceived failure, at least according to the Gentiles' incentive structure, of Christ proving that he is the Son of God, thereby the reversal that takes belief, but instead it is the transcendental deity that has fallen into the community of the faithful itself. For Hegel, we have here essentially an ontological mirror to his entire argument about the dialectic, which is that the thing emerges after the fall itself. That the figure of God is therefore no longer the end point, the transcendental horizon of earthly faith, but rather that it is the fall into the crucifixion that makes God manifest in his true form in the idea of the community faithful. So we have an ontological transition that takes place within Hegel, whereby we no longer have the transcendental point of nirvana. Instead, we have a nirvana that is accessed through its seeming fall into the community. Now, to go back to Zizek, Zizek in his footnote on Buddhism essentially argues that here we can look at one or two different ways. Transcend earthly desire and transcend his own attachment to the desire, thereby finding his true self, and then finding himself reflected in nirvana. Now, here Zizek actually has a joke where he says that you could imagine a Buddhist torturing Lacan, and essentially argues that a Buddhist would be torturing Lacan, trying to make Lacan confess nirvana can be reached. And Lacan would essentially be forced to confess that inner peace exists, and then as Lacan walks away, he would be muttering under his breath, and yet it moves. Eppur si muove. Now, the reason Žižek has this quip, and the reason that this joke works in the first place, although I should add I'm very bad at telling jokes, the reason that this joke works in the first place is that Žižek is mirroring a historical analogy about Galileo. So in this historical anecdote, not an analogy, anecdote, in this historical anecdote, Galileo is being made to confess that the earth is immutable and that it is the sun that is revolving around the earth. In other words, that the order of the heavens is fixed. And supposedly in this trial, Galileo is forced to make his confession, and he says, yes, everything is as you say it is. And supposedly, according to this anecdote, which probably has more truth in fiction than in fact, it is one of those lies that tells the truth. As around, he mutters under his breath, "Eppur si move," and yet it moves. So even though I've just confessed that the earth is the center of the universe and that it is immutable, he turns around and sort of goes, and yet it moves. Now, this "and yet it moves" is therefore the Lacanian attitude towards the impossibility of inner peace. And so what appears to be a similarity within psychoanalysis and Buddhism, which is the insistence that there is no true self, that your idea of self is a egotistic, narcissistic attachment to the necessity which here to come, namely there is no, nevertheless leads to fundamentally different ontological conclusions. That within the Buddhist edifice, nirvana nevertheless remains the transcendental horizon that has to be reached once one fully allows oneself to shed one's earthly attachment, as it were. Whereas for Lacan, the idea that there is an immutability to desire itself. That, in a sense, the ultimate desire is precisely the desire to be rid of that the ultimate ideological play is to posit an escape from ideology. Hence, you can also imagine Zizek's criticism of what he deems vulgar Buddhism, which is to say, the very idea that you could step outside of life and embrace inner peace is precisely the fantasy that allows you to sustain a distinctly unpeaceful life. That vulgar Buddhism presents itself as the perfect supplement to what Marx called alienated life within capitalism. Now, one of the ways in which we can look at this is, for example, how the idea of this, what you might call vulgar Buddhism, emphasizes the self, specifically under what appear to be its precise opposite coordinates. To put that more simply, Buddhism focuses on letting go of your material attachments, letting go of your anxieties and your fears in relation to others. And yet, precisely in this letting go, rather than transcending the idea of self, which would be a properly Buddhist gesture, it hones in on the narcissistic attachment that you have to your own identity, to your own self-expression, to your own true feelings. That here we have a kind of tunneling, which is therefore a mechanism rather than a true alternative to the alienation that we experience within capitalism. Now, one of the key things here is that this criticism for Žižek functions even though it works. Like, even though you could read a book of Buddhist principles that will make you happier, sleep better, better entrepreneur, you could find a book like this and it probably would work. The problem is precisely that it works. Here we have actually something that you could relate to an old joke about Marx, which Marx essentially teaches a class on the commodity fetish. And afterwards, one of the students comes back and says, "I took notes on everything you said, I studied really hard, I know exactly what the commodity fetish is, but I want my money back." And Marx says, "Why do you want your money back? I taught you what the commodity fetish is." And then the student says, "Because even though I know what the commodity fetish is, and yet it moves." Which that what Marx realized about the commodity fetish was that teaching you how it works doesn't expel its power. That to have an individual understanding or acknowledgement of the mechanism of fetishistic attachment that occurs within the commodity fetish is not sufficient by itself to break through the commodity fetish. In fact, that the very way in which the commodity fetish persists within capitalism is by selling you its perceived opposite, by selling you something which is supposed to be exempt from the commodity fetish. Hence, for example, why a t-shirt without a logo on it can now be more expensive than the cheap t-shirt that we see everywhere. It's also why you could say that ethical consumption, whether it's organic produce or buying, ticking a box on your next flight ticket that allows you to have some carbon offset of your emissions, is thereby precisely a version of this reification that occurs within capitalism. Yes, you know that what you are doing is bad. This is now being sold back to you as an alternative to the very thing. In other words, one of the central principles that happens under what Marxists call reification is that the solution, rather than being the actual antithesis to the problem, is in fact simply the problem in disguise. How do we deal with climate change? By buying more things, but to make it more ethical. How do we deal with wealth inequality? By creating it. Hence also why Marx argued that the whole point of liberation was precisely not to have better working conditions for workers, but to advocate for a society in which to be working class would no longer exist. That the working class is thereby the counterintuitive class that advocates for its own inexistence, namely to create a society or a structure within which it would no longer be a possibility to be considered working class. After all, the existence of the working class, rather than being a natural identity, is an identity that emerges precisely of the continued inequality that is necessary in order to sustain capitalist exploitation. That is the argument. Now, what's funny here is that essentially the whole image that people have of Marxism, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. The whole image that people have about Marxism, which is about class struggle, is precisely therefore not the struggle between classes. It's not saying that you're trying to work your way up the ladder or that you're trying to fight the capitalist overlord in any direct sense. It's also why one of the distinctly capitalist fantasies is precisely films like A Bug's Life that present to you this moment of class consciousness being the one whereby the workers realize that there are more of them than there are of us. This is not the Marxist take at all on revolution. It's not to say at a certain point the workers look around and they realize that they have the numeric superiority over the 1% and that therefore they can win against them in a fight. Instead, the moment of class consciousness for Marx is precisely the moment in which you realize that the very reason that you are the majority is because there's a system of inequality that has suggested that you are a natural class that is working its way up the ladder to be one of the rulers as well. That the secret of the rich is therefore precisely in a sense that there is no secret. That the continued secret of the rich is that it exists on the very condition that you believe that you could be one of the people that becomes rich one day too. And of course, and yet it works. There are always going to be some people who make it out of poverty, out of structural inequality, into a position of grotesque wealth, or even a little bit in the middle of this, although that's increasingly become rare. And these people will then be heralded as examples for other workers to aspire to. Thereby, it's the very success of a small percentage of the exploited that allows for the continuation of the other exploited. Now, if you want to make a vulgar analogy here between the idea of nirvana and the idea of, impossible riches, of course, nirvana should be the opposite of that. If you make the comparison between this idea of nirvana, the transcendental horizon that can be reached once you've transcended your own identity, and the transcendence of the worker's identity into this blissful, gated community, imagined life of the ultra-wealthy, you thereby have a fundamental, similar, analogous movement, which is that instead of creating nirvana, you've simply created a nirvana that consists of you being outside the rest of the world's problems. Hence, suddenly nirvana becomes an extremely privileged position that allows you to focus on yourself at the cost of not focusing on everybody else. Hence also why nirvana is then presented to you as a way for you to detach or separate yourself from others. And so in this very vulgar sense, hence also vulgar Buddhism, we have what appears to be a way they make you feel isn't real, detach yourself from your friends and your city, and we end up in essentially what becomes the Buddhist equivalent, which therefore is essentially the secular equivalent, if you think about it, of the, I always forget what the word is, the gospel by which people try to enrich themselves. It's like this American evangelical mission that focuses on wealth. There's some word for it. Generally, it always reminds me. Trump used to be a big part of these communities. Someone in the comments surely can remind me. I'm sorry that my voice is so broken today. I just got back from Portland. And so essentially, to go back to this idea that Marx has, the idea that the commodity fetish, simply because you see through it, doesn't mean that you can break through it. That, in a sense, part of how the commodity fetish, prosperity gospel, I see it in the comments, prosperity gospel. That's perfect. And so this argument that Marx has, therefore, is that the way in which the commodity fetish functions is precisely because it gives you the illusion of seeing through it, and you can't see through it. Here Zizek makes a correction to Marx. The famous Marxist famous line is, "For they know not what they do," which of course relates to the Bible, right? Christ's famous expression, "For they know not what they do." It relates to the existentialist notion of false consciousness, namely that you're laboring under false assumptions and therefore live an alienated life, towards Zizek's more contemporary critique of ideology, which is, they know precisely what they do, and yet they do it anyway. That to be alive today is to be fully cognizant of the myriad ways in which your activities contribute to the demise of the planet, the persistence of income inequality, gentrification, myriad other things that we know to be true. For some people, it's having children, etc., right? That everything you do thereby supposedly becomes cast under some kind of ideological inhibition, that you feel somehow like guilty. And what's key here is that Žižek actually relates this to his critique of identity politics. Think about one of the contemporary ways in which books against racism are being presented to a majority white middle class population, which is, here are all of the things that you are doing that could be microaggressions or instances of racism that you the structural conditions of perpetual racism within this country instead become something that is distinctly attuned to this, and yet it moves to this. They know precisely what they do, which is that these books that essentially argue that you are being racist all the time in small little ways that you cannot know feed into this entire industry, both publishing industry and entertainment industry, that could become a better person. Therefore, we find this horrific blend of presumably well-intended anti-racist literature being combined with the sort of self-help improvement lists that fall under the guise of the vulgar Buddhism. Of course, the painful symptomatic contortion or breakdown point of this is precisely some of those writers who therefore advocate that we should be colorblind, that blackness is simply another form of attachment to a meaningless signifier, and that to be truly enlightened we should simply let go of the idea of race itself. Here we find the problematic, ideologically suspicious, if you will, universalizing tendency that occurs under the auspices of a supposedly Buddhist gesture. One of the things that I've argued in previous lectures, for example, is that this insistence on universalization, we're not one color or another color, we're all human beings, is precisely a dehumanizing gesture. That if you think in the most radical extreme example, that the manner in which ideologically the Holocaust was perpetuated was precisely to say there is no Bulgarian Jew and a Hungarian Jew and an Italian Jew. There is only the Jew, capital J Jew. Completely paranoid master signifier is precisely what allows for the ultimate dehumanization of what occurs in the concentration camps. That therefore what appears to be a liberal gesture on universalization always contains its absolutely horrific other core within. So here we are back at the problem of Buddhism for a moment. The problem of Buddhism, as Žižek frames it, is that do we aspire individually to reach a point of nirvana, a point of transcendence, in which we've successfully seen through the illusionary nature of the world around us, and then secondarily, and this is crucial, perform the same sadomasochistic task upon ourselves, which is to say, who do you think you are to be important? Why do you think that yourself has any more real quality to it than the world around you? And therefore of our desire in relation to the imaginary object, the other, to realize ourself as other, as object. Does this simply mean that we transcend the horizon of desire and exist in some kind of immutable existence? Or does it mean that we reach a point in which, by means of liberating ourself, we liberate everybody else? Here we have actually an interesting movement that we can relate back to Lacon and Marx. There's a key similarity between Lacanian psychoanalysis and Marxist economic analysis, or you could actually say religious analysis. The famous passage is the one in which Marx says that religion is the opium of the people. This, of course, has been adopted as a kind of atheist quote that, religion is what keeps the people oppressed, and that therefore what we have to do is fight religion and wake up into enlightenment, and therefore we'll be liberated, and that it's called vulgar atheistic take on Marx. And yet, if you read the entire passage, what's really interesting here is that Marx essentially argues, and he does it very directly, it's not even that obtuse. He argues that the point is not to fight the believers. The point is not to say religion is bad, and so if you believe in religion, you're an idiot, which seems to be a lot of the contemporary libertarian, atheist, Reddit-y energy surrounding atheism right now. Instead, for Marx, the point is to say religion is the symptom of alienated life within capitalism. Because people alienate, they hold on to their belief. Hence, we do not fight religion by fighting against the religious, which would be a form of punching down almost. Instead, the goal is to create a world in which religion would no longer be necessary. In a sense, you could even perform a very un-Marxist Christian analysis of this, which is to say that this is also the key idea of the Last Judgment. That the Last Judgment isn't a temporal sequence. It's not the moment that occurs at the end. The Last Judgment would be the moment at which judgment would no longer be necessary, at which the entire relation of the worldly fall in relation to the ideal big other in the sky, the transcendental deity, has fully vanished and fallen away. The one point at which the community of the faithful truly looks at itself and says God is a ontological sequence by which the Last Judgment comes at the end. But the Last Judgment is occurring perpetually in its own unfolding. The owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk. Dusk, therefore, becomes the crucifixion, the moment of the New Testament. That would be one way to look at it. Now, Marx therefore argues that the point isn't to fight against the religious, but to see how religion functions as a symptom, you might even put it in less terms as a crutch, in capitalism. Yet the argument isn't against the faithful. The argument is to build a society in which religion would no longer be a crutch, therefore taking on its true value. Now, here we can make a Marxist argument, or we can make a Christian argument, which I believe to be very similar. The Marxist argument is to say, well, at this point, religion will simply fade away, and religion will be replaced by communism. Communism will therefore be the technical version of communism is the universal that doesn't succumb into its particular. In other words, not the false universal, not the capital J Jew, not the dehumanizing universality, but instead the moment of universality in which nothing is out of joint, in which everything clicks and everything suddenly comes together. It's the historical necessity of the undermining of capitalism through a new form of non-alienated life. That would be the Marxist take. We no longer need religion because we have communism. Of course, the more obvious critique of ideology stance is to say, what if religion is communism? That therefore, the moment that you have within communism is simply another form of religion, vowing the necessity by which religion fades away into the new state-sanctioned form of religion, namely Soviet communism, right? And yet, if you come at it from a Christian perspective, you could say almost the exact opposite. That the Last Judgment, or communism, or the idea of true religion, namely not the false idol, is thereby precisely communism by another name. If we take Buddhism, as Žižek and Žižek talk about it, that the idea of communism finds its exiting the cave. It finds its mirror in the idea of a religion that finds itself in a true universal connection outside the idea of the transcendental deity. Hence also why, for Zizek, Buddhism, rather than being or at least vulgar Buddhism, as we experience it today within our Western world, rather than being a true emergence of something new, some new consciousness, instead Buddhism is precisely the opium of the people. That Buddhism becomes the way in which you allow yourself to persist and continue thriving within the conditions of your own exploitation. Hence also Zizek's famous line that we lack the very freedom to articulate our unfreedom. that freedom is therefore not simply the opposite of unfreedom, but that it is precisely because we are free that we cannot articulate our unfreedom. That the manner in which exploitation occurs today is precisely not through direct oppression from above, but by the exploitation of the oppression to ourselves. That the manner in which we think and dream and desire is precisely structured by a necessity or a cultural condition, an incentive structure that lies outside of our own choosing, which is one that is overdetermined by capitalism. Now, I want to say briefly here that this isn't simply a capitalism is bad argument. It's not a normative critique. One of the things that I come across constantly is, oh, the entire leftist position is to simply point the finger at capitalism as what you hate and not to posit any kind of alternative that would somehow present itself as a given. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what the leftist critique is. It is not about providing an alternative. It is instead to argue that capitalism from within, from the unfolding of its own contradictions, will provide its own alternative. Hence, the very idea of an alternative being posited to you that would present itself as making capitalism more livable is precisely a fantasy that occurs within capitalism as such. Hence also why vulgar Buddhism, which then simply becomes a narcissistic attachment to your own privileged, thereby privileged understanding of yourself, apropos the illusionary nature of the others, is therefore the opium of the people, the opium that allows you to persist more effectively within capitalism precisely because it works. Now, I'm going to take one moment there. I said that this also relates to Lacanian psychoanalysis. So within Marx, we see the critique of religion as the opium of the people. I should also add here that Žižek has joked, building upon Simone Weil, that today it's not so much that religion is the opium of the people, but that the people is the opium of the people. That the resurgent idea of populism and sort of master signifiers about the decline of democracy, etc., is precisely the way in which this opium functions. However, from a Lacanian perspective, Lacon makes a very similar argument to Marx about Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacan says, what would make psychoanalysis successful? Well, what would make it successful would be to create a world in which psychoanalysis would no longer be needed. In other words, in an analogous movement to Marx's critique of political economy and revolution, Lacan says that instead of creating a world in which we have more psychoanalysts helping more people, the point should be to create a world in which psychoanalysis is no longer necessary. That it essentially exists on the horizon of its own unbecoming. That the more successful it is, the less necessary it becomes. Now, this isn't simply in terms of clinical therapy. It's not to say you have been cured and therefore you no longer need me. But that psychoanalysis, rather than touching to the core root of biologically determined problems or brain chemicals, etc., that psychoanalysis is itself a symptom of alienated life. That the very insistence on psychoanalysis is a form of repressed existence. Hence also, like, what's important here is if you go back to Freud and the Freudian idea of psychoanalysis, the key distinction is between the subconscious and the unconscious. The positing of the subconscious, everybody knows this, is that you have this inner demon within you. You have like it's like Jekyll and Hyde, that there's a level of your consciousness that you don't have access to that somehow determines your actions. And that thereby, if you understand your subconscious and you learn to take control of it, you can be the civilized gentleman. You can be the person who takes charge. We're back at the comforting fantasy or myth of the Stoic, which is that the Stoic is the man who has seized control over his surroundings and over himself. It's this idea that there is therefore a false self and a true self that you can embrace above and beyond it. The Freudian Insight, the so-called discovery of the unconscious, is precisely to posit that there is no monster underneath. Hence also there is no good version of you above. That the ultimate fantasy for Freud is precisely that you could neatly delineate between your subconscious and what is above consciousness. Instead, for Freud, the much more traumatic thing that we carry within us all the time is precisely that there is no that there is no subconscious that is neatly detached from the consciousness, but that rather the very nature of the unconscious persists in its intangible, immutable existence. Let me give you an example of that might make it easier or harder depending on what your background is. Žižek makes an ontological argument that exactly mirrors the idea of the Freudian unconscious. He says, the central metaphysical proposition should never be the choice between something and nothing. It should never be, oh, we have nothingness out of which something came, nor should it be we have something that's inevitably reducing to nothingness. In other words, it's not the transcendental principle by which we go from zero to transcendence, nor is it like the Nirvana principle, or that we see like within like the Higgs boson principle, by which matter simply reduces to like a no energy zero sum point. It's neither an upward movement nor is it a downward movement. Instead, Zizek says the choice is never between something or nothing on metaphysical terms. The choice is always between something. I'm getting this totally wrong. Sorry. This is key, so I can't say this wrong. That's why I have to make weird noises. The choice is not between something versus nothing, or nothing versus something. Instead, the choice is between nothing and less than nothing. Hence also the title of Zizek's famous book on Hegel, Less Than Nothing. The ontological proposition is therefore that we don't simply have a nothing from which something stems, or vice versa, a something that reduces back to nothingness, but that rather the something, the concrete thing, is never a plus one, but a less than nothing. It is a repression or a tension, an out-of-jointedness that is immanent to the nothingness itself. Hence also from a Freudian perspective, inner peace cannot exist. From a Lacanian perspective, inner peace cannot be achieved. That one of the, to put this in a slightly more vulgar way, although Žižek himself argues this, which is uncharacteristic, that one of the beauties of being alive and of the necessity of our own creative pursuits is precisely that we remain forever stuck, forever out of joint, that we don't fit into the world, we don't fit into our own bodies, into our own minds. There's also links up to Zizek's criticism of the idea that young people should be given time to fully explore their own sexual identities and to make a choice before they can interact in the world, because for Zizek, the idea of a sexual identity is itself the marker of an immutable problem, which is the non-tautological relationship of yourself to your own sexual identity, which is a fancy way of saying that no one has it figured out, that the attachment to a heteronormative way of viewing the world and gender and sexual identity is precisely a hysterical response to this immutable inconsistency that is the self. And of course, for Lacon, therefore, the transition, the traversing the fantasy from desire to drive, is thereby to dispel the illusion or myth of desire, to detach it from its seemingly fixed moorings, to say that what appears to you as necessary principle, I desire this because this is what I need to be happy, this is what I need to be successful, you dismantle that as being illusionary. Who teaches you what to desire? Who teaches you what to dream? Why do you want what other people have? Why do you feel like you need to signal to them that you're happy or successful? The first step is to thereby dismantle the seemingly necessary relationship between the self and desire. But then, where Lacan and Freud completely go in the opposite direction of Buddhism, is to say that the goal is therefore not to then dispel yourself as illusionary in order to be reunited with Nirvana. Instead, it is to embrace the impossibility of fully transcending desire and turning it into drive. What's key here, this is not drive as in The Rock. This is not drive as in hustle, grind, core culture, grind culture. This is not work more effectively because you've seen it through illusion. It's specifically not saying something like, while other people are having fun at parties, you're working hard at your investing job or something, right? It's nothing to do with that. Instead, the argument about drive is the argument about and yet it moves. Remember, Galileo walks away, has confessed that the earth is immutable, that it doesn't move, that it exists in its static necessity, and simply moves away and says, and yet it moves. Lacan makes the same argument about drive, that at the exact moment at which you think that you have found an escape from desire, inner peace, you have precisely allowed yourself into the illusion of existing beyond desire, hence foregoing or repressing, foreclosing, the fact that what you now desire is the absence of desire. To put this like in a very simplistic, like rhetorical function, Lacan essentially argues that when you deny the body, you become denial embodied. That the immutable problem the ascetic or the hermit is therefore precisely that he or she or they or whatever say, I am withholding from myself everything in the world, and yet what you are stuck with is the body. In a sense, we can see here the truth of the existentialist principle that the only true question worth examining in life is whether or not to kill oneself. Trigger warning, by the way, please do not kill yourself. That the problem of the body is therefore precisely its immutable persistence, not just in its bodily needs and like the more vulgar attributes. After all, in typically Freudian fashion, Zizek has a very joyful emphasis on bodily emissions, etc. Because what they do, what the hiccup or what the burp or the fart or the diarrhea or whatever it reminds us of is, of course, that we are not in charge of our body. And yet, instead of the sort of more vulgar Buddhist thing to say you are not in charge of your body controls you, the idea that you have control of your body is a fundamental illusion that you have to let go of. The argument from a Freudian Lacanian perspective is that this tension, this combat between the supposedly like overarching control of your body versus the illusionary attachment to the self is precisely a coping mechanism of fantasy. That for Freud, all the emissions that are supposedly involuntary, the tics, the twitches, the burps, the farts, the bad dreams, etc., that all of those are therefore symptomatic. They're not reminding you that you are simply a puppet that has illusionary attachment to desire. They're reminding you that you are nothing but the puppet fighting against its own strings, to put it in a colorful way. That the true self, while it doesn't exist for the Buddhist and it doesn't exist for the Lacanian Freudian psychoanalyst, that the true self, therefore, for Lacan remains the immutable problem, namely the truest nature of yourself is precisely that there is no true self, versus the Buddhist idea that you have to let go of the attachment to the self altogether. Now, I want to wrap up a little bit here because there's more I want to talk about, but we're sort of running out of time. So let me rephrase very quickly. Zizek's argument about Buddhism is that its relationship to Nirvana is key, and that its relationship to Nirvana is therefore fundamentally attached to the relationship of desire. Nirvana and desire. The central transcendental proposition within Buddhism is that you're on this wheel of desire and that you have to detach yourself from it, thereby achieving nirvana. Essentially, you could argue that nirvana is therefore a realm that you enter once you have surpassed your investment, your libidinal investment into the world. Or you could make the argument that nirvana is a collective state that we reach once your own individual liberation matches the liberation of everybody else. Zizek's criticism, to put it very bluntly, is that Buddhism, especially in its more vulgar, popular, materialistic Western stance, rather than being antithetical to alienated life within capitalism and consumer society, becomes supplementive to it. It becomes something that allows you to enjoy it thus the more, because what makes one of the differentials between capitalism and late capitalism is that the nature of exploitation is no longer simply the nature of exploitation that you experience as a worker in a factory, but precisely how you are asked to exploit yourself. That the burden of responsibility of production is put back onto you. The necessity for creating the ideological supplement, the fantasy that underlies your libidinal investment in your career or in your, your aspiring towards wealth, etc., is precisely something that you now have to take care of yourself. And that under these conditions, which for Zizek is therefore less honest than brutal direct exploitation, because at least under brutal direct exploitation, you can hate the master, that under these conditions, you are told that you are your own master, that you are the most liberated free agent, as long as you're free to sell your own labor, as it were. Hence, Zizek argues that we find within vulgar examples of Buddhism, the sort of self-help minded Buddhism, not just the opium of the people, namely the necessarily symptomatic emergence of a kind of cope within alienated life, but precisely something that fits all too well into the logic of late capitalism, which is that now your lifestyle isn't predicated on all the things that you've decided to purchase and buy. Now your lifestyle is predicated on the fact that you can always return to the cultivation of your own self, the garden of your own mind, etc. That we can all retreat into our own inner selves, thereby creating walls that precisely allow us to persistently ignore the problems that exist around us. This argument then about Buddhism, Zizek uses to make a more philosophical argument, or an ontological, metaphysical one, about Hegel and Freud. Essentially, what Žižek argues here is that the eporsi moove, the immutable necessity of desire, the idea that even when you desire to not desire, you are therefore desiring, this negative identity, the problem of the body as the marker of negativity, is something that we see mirrored within the Freudian unconscious and the Freudian death drive. The joke is, like, for example, one of my favorite jokes, all trips are guilt trips. The same is true for Freud when it comes to the drive. All drives are death drives. That the weird thing about work and the liberation of drive is that it's its own form of immortality that exists as a kind of negation. That in order to work, in order to do anything, in order to be creative, in order to aspire, you have to step outside of life. But this isn't just true for work. Think about love, for example, or having children. That the very things that seem to fill you with meaning and make life worth living are things that make you step outside of life and consider them in a different way. That one of the paradoxes of life is precisely that we only really experience it in the moments at which we enact a kind of momentary living death. We put ourselves aside. We become subject to something or to someone. An athlete is subject to the crowd, but also subject to the idea of the sport. An athlete is trying to be like his heroes. A creative artist is trying to be like his heroes. A parent is trying to be like their parent or the opposite of their parents. That this attachment that we have to the other, which in a sense fills in the empty space within desire, is drive. Why we do something and what fantastic illusionary nature we have it to others. Hence also why the deeply perverted stance, remember the slogan at Auschwitz is Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. What was perverted about it was precisely that there is a truth to it. And yet the one thing that those in the concentration camps were not allowed to do was to work in any meaningful capacity, simply to be the pure agents of the historical drive of the Nazi exploitation. I mean, that's a terrible way of putting it, but essentially to be slaves. And that what happens is that Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, is true, but something that happens within contemporary society is we're told work sets you free has become tautologically inverted into work is free. You are free because you work. And now you can see the horrific reversal that occurs here between work sets you free, work being the form of drive by which you actualize the necessity of your inner being, not by finding some moment of inner peace where you no longer have to work, hence also the problem of like retirement, like what do? Well, I golf when it's a nice day and I do bureaucracy when it's raining or something. Instead of saying work sets you free, which therefore has an ontological truth to it, which is that we find freedom precisely in limiting our own freedom, it becomes work equals freedom. You are free because you are working. And that is precisely the ideological thing that happens within late capitalism. It's not saying work will set you free. It's saying work equals freedom. You are free because you are free to sell your labor. And why do you sell your labor? So that you can rise up the ranks, you can participate in your own imaginary class struggle against others, by which someday you too can retire as one of the privileged elites. And the cruel thing is that we don't really have a choice, because with the absence of safety nets, if you're not working in this rat race, it means that you are asking to be screwed, essentially. And that if you want to take care of your family and your loved ones, you have to participate. And so we're back at Zizek's correction to Marx, which is it's not, and yet they know not what they do, for they know not what they do. Instead it's, and yet it's, they know exactly what they do, and yet they do it precisely. They do it anyway. That thereby the necessity of your own absence of choice to participate in the given incentive structures is sold back to you as the fantasy of you are your own man. You are completely free. Therefore, the condition for true freedom, for Zizek, the condition which you might call nirvana or whatever, by which you tap into your authentic self, is not simply foregoing the idea of authentic selfhood, but it is finding ways of working and expressing yourself that is genuinely free. That is genuinely something that fills your life with purpose and meaning and necessity. Something which you would do until the day you die. You're not doing it to escape your plight. You're doing it because it is It is the impossible way in which you would like to live. It is your symptom. Hence also why we can now understand, I did this like a couple lectures ago, why traversing the fundamental fantasy for Lacan isn't simply the movement from desire to drive, but it is the move away from wanting to rid yourself of your symptom to identifying with your symptom. How do you identify with your symptom? It's by embracing the impossible out-of-jointedness of your own creative strife, that every single day you feel like you could have done better or differently, that you tackle the problem anew. My favorite example is the documentary about Hayao Miyazaki, the legendary animator and director at Studio Ghibli, who essentially embraces his symptom, that he will never finish making movies, that he's constantly trying to retire, that he drives himself crazy and others crazy because he is constantly trying to create, to express something which cannot be expressed. Think about dance, think about Wim Wenders' Pina Bausch documentary, where Pina Bausch says that the thing about dance is that it can only hint at things which cannot be expressed through language. And that this hinting at, not the figuration or the symbolic rendition of something in its vulgar, literal form, but the hinting at that which can only be hinted at, which cannot be expressed other than through this failure to be symbolized, is what dance is. That is identifying with your symptom. It is to embrace the futility as being the futility of creativity as necessary to its central purpose. Thereby, you find a beauty in your work. You find a freedom in your failure. You find a kind of necessary hysterical impossibility of ever being truly satisfied. And therefore, the idea of nirvana no longer lies within a transcendental horizon, something which can be reached when you find inner peace. Instead, the idea of nirvana is precisely when you embrace the lack of inner peace, when you give yourself up to the creative frenzy and passion that is implicit in the dirty, messy conditions of falling in love or creating art or raising a family, that this idea of perfection, of the kind of Marie Kondoing of your life into a state of blissful, non-toxic nirvana existence is neither truly Buddhist, but is certainly not Lacanian or psychoanalytic. Now we can go back to the joke that I mentioned earlier. That's what I want to wrap up with. Zizek says, well, can imagine a Buddhist torturing Lacan to make him confess that inner peace exists. At a certain point, succumbing to the pain, Lacan confesses, yes, inner peace exists. And then Lacan walks away and he says, and yet it moves. Et pour si muove. And yet it moves is precisely Lacan's version of inner peace. Yes, there is a form of inner peace, but it lies neither in the transcendental horizon outside of the world of desire and illusion, nor does it lie within the full embrace that there is no true self. Instead, inner peace lies within the embrace of your symptom, the embrace of the necessity of your own failure to truly be yourself, to hysterically contort yourself into all of those fruitful failures that art and love and life consist of. And that therefore, within this absence of inner peace, perhaps an inner peace can be found, one that never lies still, but is constantly in motion, and yet it moves. That is Zizek's take on Buddhism through a Lacanian Marxist Hegelian lens, as best as I can explain it, which is probably not very well, in under an hour. Thank you guys so much for listening. I truly appreciate it. I'm going to continue this lecture series next week, so if you're curious about this, please do feel free to join me next week. Plus, as always, you can download all of my lectures, plus my ebook, on Patreon. Huge thank you to our patrons. There's also edited transcripts. I do a bonus Q&A after every lecture, which is very fun, available for patrons as an audio download. All that and more you can find on Patreon if you go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Thank you so much. It has been my pleasure to start my week with you. Thank you for joining us from around the world, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.